my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Joyce M. Davis. I'm very excited to learn from her today. She has an incredible background. She is the opinion editor for Penn Live and the Patriot News and president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg, an organization she founded in 2010 with a group of internationally connected community leaders in central Pennsylvania. Dr. Davis spent 5 years as Director of Communications for the City of Harrisburg and supervisor of WHBG Channel 20, the region's government and public affairs television station. Before moving to Harrisburg, Dr. Davis was Associate Director of Broadcasting for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Prague, Czech Republic. In her senior role at the International Broadcasting Agency, Davis supervised hundreds of reporters and editors assigned to radio and internet services to Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the countries of Central Asia. She has also worked as deputy foreign editor and special correspondent for Knight Ridder newspapers, Middle East editor, and senior foreign editor for NPR. She began her journalism career at the New Orleans Times. You're going to have to pronounce this one for me. Picayune. Questions I should have asked before this. Where among many roles, she was the editor of an international op-ed column for the editorial page, an idea she initiated due to her early interest in global affairs. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Davis to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And picayune is a hard word to say, I will tell you. Do you know what it means? Okay, some people know it means penny. That's what the newspaper used to cost, a penny, back when it was founded. But I am glad to be here with you today, and I thank Jeremy and Felicia for inviting me to talk about and to be a part of this most important conversation about journalism. It is indeed, journalistic freedom is indeed one of the most important issues, I believe, of our day, not only globally, but locally. And let's just get right to it. Journalism today is a dangerous profession. It used to be that the danger was confined to crazy people like me who would go around the world in war zones or conflict zones, foreign correspondents. But I would argue today, even local journalists at newspapers or just online face dangers, especially if they step into politics. On the international scene, Statista.com says data gathered from countries across the globe has revealed that 45 journalists were killed worldwide last year. It's the worst period, actually, for journalists may have been in 2012 when 147 were killed, largely because they dared to go in and cover the civil war in Syria. But Reporters Without Borders says more than 1,700 journalists have been killed during their job since 2000. Now, this is a result of outright murders, contract killings, ambushes, and deaths in war zone or natural disasters while they were on assignment. That's an average of 80 journalists killed every year. The total kills since 2000 is more than 1,700. But in addition to what's going on overseas and abroad, I think it's the most dangerous time for journalists here at home. In the United States, journalists are under attack, as is the media in general. Just reporting on a political issue can bring hate mail and threats. I should know because I handle the editorials in Pennsylvania. And around the world, journalists of all nationalities are on the front lines trying to cover their own communities. And in Gaza, we know they are definitely facing death. I also know firsthand of these dangers. I've worked in the Middle East. I've worked as a foreign correspondent and editor, as you've heard, for such respected organizations as National Public Radio, Knight Ridder newspapers, then the second largest newspaper chain in the United States. And I've reported from volatile regions like Israel and the West Bank, and I've gone into refugee camps and met with people who had dedicated themselves to jihad. In fact, I have traveled the world to interview people, our world, considers terrorists. Their world considers them martyrs. But I have also worked under the banner of U.S. diplomacy as a senior executive with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, based in Prague. There I worked with journalists from around the world, and I directly supervised services to Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and all of Central Asia. It seems that journalists around the world are working during the most perilous times in recent years, putting their very lives on the line to ensure people know what's going on in their own communities and beyond. The Committee to Protect Journalists monitors the security situation of reporters working around the globe. And just a glance at its website, go ahead, you can see it, says, the first says, Iranian economics reporter begins a 5-month sentence in Karaj prison. Cuban journalist questioned about social media posts is jailed. Iraqi Kurdish journalist is free from prison, but not from threats. And CPJ urges Argentine President Javier Milei to end attacks on press freedom. So far this year, 21 journalists have been killed, most of them Arab journalists covering the war in Gaza. But we should also note Miat Tutan, killed in Myanmar. His death was listed as a murder. Today, journalists all over the world are being murdered. When I worked in Prague, we were always worried about the health and safety of our journalists. And one was killed actually in Prague as they were headed to the metro station. But I also remember vividly, because I was working with Radio Free Iraq when the US was invading, and I remember reporter Kamal Khalaf was kidnapped as she was leaving her home to go to the office, April 3rd, 2002 in Baghdad. And they later found her body, which had been mutilated. But journalists who accept the offer to work with the United States in covering the countries around the world, and especially those closed societies where the governments don't want the people to know what's going on, they know they're undertaking dangerous jobs, but they're committed. And the journalists and the services under my supervision were in some of the most dangerous places in the world. They were working to bring democracy to their countries, and they were willing to take the risk. Here's the problem, as I came to know it. That risk doesn't just involve the person, that journalist, but also their families. Some were still living in home countries, many of their family members, and vulnerable to being used as hostages and pawns in international intrigue. I recall the director of our service in Turkmenistan sharing with me that her brother was being held in a notorious prison where he could barely stand up, just a cell. He's being used as leverage against her. The same was true for journalists working in several of our broadcast services. Remember, these people are providing news and information to countries that don't want their people to know what's going on. And unlike, for example, Voice of America, that we broadcast information about the United States and the world in English, these journalists are broadcasting in their native languages, telling them what's going on in their own backyards. So, and we are broadcasting throughout the world, in Asia, in Africa, and throughout the Middle East. Today, the United States Agency for Global Media, that's what it's now called, used to be called U.S. International Broadcasting, is providing information to people around the world through Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, Middle East Broadcasting Networks, and people really, just as they did during the Cold War, are listening. This is their lifeline to truth. Many Americans, many here, do not know of the great work the United States global media and its mission to provide information to people around the world. You're not aware of this and about the sacrifices many of these journalists are making to ensure the free flow of information into societies that are still very much closed. Most of all, many Americans are not aware that journalists are on the front lines and suffer serious threats to personal safety. I'd like to use this opportunity to make you aware of just some of the journalists who are now being detained in foreign countries. You may know of the Wall Street Journal reporter, Evan Gershkovich, who was detained in March 2023 on charges of spying. He was detained by Russia's Federal Security Services and is still being held. This is the first time a journalist working for an American outlet has been arrested on charges of spying in Russia since the Cold War. The White House and media advocacy groups have condemned the arrest and are working to free him. But Vladimir Putin is using him as a pawn with the United States because of our opposition to his invasion of Ukraine. But I also want to make sure you know about Alsu Kurmashev. She is in prison in Russia. She's been there since October 2023. I worked with her when I was in Prague. She is an American citizen who is a wife and mother. RFERL, Radio Free Europe, has demanded her immediate release, but she has already spent more than 100 days in prison. The U.S. State Department has designated Alsu as wrongfully detained and is working for her release. She began her career with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in 1998 and is a journalist with the Tatar-Bashkir service. She holds both U.S. and Russian citizenship and was living in Prague with her husband and 2 children. She was detained in Kazan, Russia, and while she was trying to visit her elderly, sick mother. And now she is being held accused, basically, of being a foreign agent. She was initially temporarily detained as she was trying to do a return flight to the U.S., and they took her passport, both her Russian and U.S. passports, and prevented her from leaving. Then they came back, saw what a prize she was for the Russian government to hold on to, and declared her a foreign agent. And they are now looking at even compiling charges. She could face more than 15 years in prison. Her imprisonment has been condemned by many governments, Canada, Poland, Sweden, and human rights and press freedom organizations are calling for her release. Amnesty International, the whole gamut. Everyone is alarmed about what this means. The Committee to Protect Journalists says her arrest is the most egregious instance to date of the abusive use of Russia's foreign agents legislation against independent press. And I could go on and on about the people who are speaking out about this because it is truly, truly horrendous. But I also want to tell you 2 Russian journalists have been detained, claimed that they are extremists, working for a group founded by Alexei Navalny. Konstantin Gabov and Sergei Karelin are accused of being producers for Navalny and posting his messages on YouTube, on Navalny Live. That has millions of viewers in Russia, and Putin do not like that. So, as you know, Navalny was considered an extremist traitor, and anyone who worked with him is considered the same. Members of his team have been imprisoned, and many live in exile. Anyone associated with him is truly in danger. Now, I've offered you just a glimpse of what journalists are facing around the world, but let me just zero in here. Journalists are facing similar things in our own country. In the last cycle of presidential elections, many local journalists thought it smart, to don bulletproof vests to just report on political campaigns, on campaign rallies. This is the same armor I used to give to our reporters who went into the war zone to cover Iraq. This should not be acceptable in the United States of America. But I fear it is exactly what journalists will have to face in the coming months as we lead to another showdown in November. If you are not a supporter of your local media, I urge you to become one immediately. A free press cannot survive without public support, including becoming paying subscribers for those services. We can't take for granted our access to news and information that is reliable and trustworthy. Friends, we live in a wild, wild west of misinformation and outright lies, and people are believing them. It will only get worse. And with AI and foreign interference, our elections really are in danger. American citizens like you must do all that you can to support media freedom at home and around the world. The survival of our democracy, your personal well-being, and the future of your children very much depends on it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for those remarks. You truly have a rich background in what we're facing today, where we have been in the past, and the importance of addressing some of these issues that we're facing. I wanted to ask, you mentioned both abroad and at home the dangers that journalists are now facing. How do we continue to promote journalism as a profession? There are fewer who are willing to go into it, though those who do are strongly passionate about that. Do you see a way that we can encourage our youth and our upcoming generation to want to enter this industry?
Well, yeah, but I tell you, you really do have to want to do this. it's like a call. You can't be a pastor if you're not called to be a pastor, right? You got to be called to be a journalist, especially this kind of journalism, where you really are going to risk whatever it is to bring the truth, or the truth as it has been revealed to you. Because I'm also aware that when I go in and report, I have to make sure I'm getting as many voices as possible, not just hearing one voice or one truth. But I think, first of all, to encourage those young people now to realize that this is a profession as important as medicine or anything else. One of the ways we do it, we have at the World Affairs Council every summer a summer internship program. And we get about 20 high school and college students. The college students supervise the high school students. They all put on an International Young Leaders Conference at the end. But one of them, I ask each one of them to please, you must, to complete this program, do an op-ed or at least a letter to the editor about some topic of importance. From that, I now have a youth columnist who is going to be a journalist. Her name is Arusha Dedya. We have another young lady, Suharti Kulkarni, who is going to be writing soon for us a regular column on AI and youth, artificial intelligence. So, and all of them, they learn to write, they learn to express themselves, and if they have that inner passion, they will go on. We will encourage them to go on to become journalists.
Thank you. You'd brought up AI again now, and as well as in your talk, and I was hoping that we'd be able to address that a bit. With the problem we have with fake news, and with the labeling of what is fake news, how do you see AI complicating that? And are there steps that we can take as consumers of the news, as well as what can journalists and editors do to approach this really difficult and emerging subject?
Well, let's start with, right now, one of the things that social media has done is made everybody a journalist, right? Everybody's out there reporting in that. But what we're learning with AI and all of this, here's the thing. You really need to have trusted sources of information. You really need to have places you go, and I'm telling that to our young people. You can get those texts sent to you, and they're getting, but can you trust it? Is this somebody that you know is taking the time to really get the truth? And yes, you have to make sure the person that you're seeing named Joyce Davis speaking to you is really Joyce Davis. So it is going to be important that we check our sources, but I think good news organizations and good journalists are going to become more valuable than ever.
Great. I wanted to talk a little bit as well about kind of this dual problem that we have. We have ever sensationalized news where the funding model for journalism is somewhat driving that, especially with the change from more traditional media and advertising funding those to moving really more online, opinion-based. You have a lot more commentary rather than a more straightforward reporting of facts. How do we, the flip side of this, as consumers drive that with our unwillingness to maybe read much longer pieces or be willing to do that research to say, is this more objective? Can you talk a little bit about both how that funding model is driving some of these concerns we're seeing, but also what we may be doing as citizens that complicate the problem and what we can do to start to overcome that?
Yeah, well, one thing that causes me a little concern is that we are in a funding crisis with media. We really are, and unfortunately, what you click on means that's what we ought to. So, would you prefer me perhaps to do a commentary or report more on what's the biggest pizza in Utah, or would you prefer me to report on something a little bit more substantive, like what legislators, how they're spending their funds? So, because you're paying more attention and you seem to reward by looking at the ads, the frivolous, the sensational, instead of the deep and penetrating and investigative journalism, you're going to get frivol. You're going to get the frivolous. And that's why I made the plea at the end, if you're not a subscriber to your local newspaper or your local news organization, that's a crime right now. You really do need to support, make sure that the funding is there for them to do honest, good journalism. So it begins really with you. What are you supporting? What are you paying for? And again, are you making your views known? Because let me tell you, when I get a letter, I read it. When the president of the news organization gets a letter or an email, they actually read it. And they say, Joyce, did you see what that person wrote? And I said, yeah, I did see what they wrote. Let me get back to them. We do respond. We do care. It's important. Speak out to them. Let them know. But it really begins with your supporting a free press at home and also abroad, making sure that your congresspeople know that they should continue to support organizations like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America. Those are important. And guess what? They could have their funding cut just because somebody thinks who needs to do that. And sometimes politics does interfere even with their reporting. So we just have to make sure those are independent news organizations, that they're operating based solely on getting true and valid information out to the world.
Great, thank you. So I would love to encourage you to really follow up on this excellent advice. I think this can be really bleak, sometimes looking at where journalism is headed, but I find it encouraging to see that your voice really does matter, your click really matters. Talking to your elected officials, reaching out to your local news agency really does make a difference. So thank you for underscoring that for us. I wanted to pivot a little bit. You mentioned many who have been detained or killed for the work that they're doing abroad. How are you seeing that play out in some of the conflicts that we're seeing? What are some of the efforts that you see organizations doing to try and support these journalists that they are sending abroad, or often when it's their own domestic journalists who are facing this violence?
Yeah, well, first of all, on the international front, you all probably realize we have less reporting from overseas. I mean, there are whole parts of the world, let's start with Africa, that just don't get covered, right? The atrocities going on in Sudan or, Haiti, right? We're not really looking at that every day. If you get the New York Times, you'll probably get a little smidgen of some of this. But there's a lot that international reporting has been pulled back tremendously. And that's a shame for you as Americans. The truth is, if you were aggressive, you could find it, because there's the internet. So if you really wanted to know about Sudan, you could. And now even foreign news services, you can get it translated. The problem is it trustworthy information? And that's what you have. So we need to encourage more of our good organizations to actually report on the news and on places that they have been ignoring. That's number one. Locally, You heard in my closing remarks, I'm really worried about the months that we're headed into, because I think it's going to get really nasty. And here's the problem. When a journalist simply reports what's happening, they are seen to necessarily be siding with what's happening. So, or if people don't like the slant or the way they think, then the reporter will be the subject of the well, ridicule is one thing, but be the subject of threats. That's my concern. And we're hearing reports all along the way that this is going to be a nasty election season. So what can we do about it? Well, me as a journalist, I'm just going to keep doing my job. But I have made it clear, I have zero tolerance for any kind of personal threat. You threaten me, you're going to the FBI, okay? I'm not even going to play with you. So I will still get your stupid emails, that's fine, I'm stupid. But I will not get any kind of personal threats, okay? I will not take that. Although I expect that might come, and we'll have to deal with it. But overall, what you have to do is, in your own circles, because many of us have people on all sides of the political spectrum, make sure you reinforce that there's peaceful dialogue, there are peaceful elections, and that you don't support any kind of threats or violence against journalists. It starts one handshake at a time, one conversation at a time, in your local churches, in your Rotary clubs, in all of those different places that you may be interacting with people of different political persuasions. There's a way we as Americans disagree, but maintain our democracy.
That's really helpful. I think it's easy for us to look to other countries and easily identify when a journalist ends up in prison, or when there seems to have been foul play and pressure from the government on reporting. And yet it can be quite shocking to realize the danger that our journalists face here at home. And that increasing polarization that we see playing out even in our own communities, our own families, sometimes I don't think we realize the extent to what that is happening in that journalistic sphere. With that, how can we encourage that dialogue? You mentioned, that one handshake at a time. How can we start to have more respectful dialogue? So other than the personal and that person-to-person contact, is there something that we can do to support and maybe spread that idea of how we having better dialogue and calling out those maybe online that we're seeing and hurting journalists? Is there something that we can do in that direction to try and have a bigger impact? You mentioned reporting to the FBI, if that's something that happens to you, reaching out to Congress people. What are some actions that we can take to try and change some of those conversations about what is and is not appropriate to level at someone on the internet or an official journalist?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, it also begins with having your antenna up. What is it now? If you hear something or see something, say something. If you're seeing someone going across the line and it's not just disagreeing with the political, like, okay, this money shouldn't be given to this program, but should be given to that program, that's great. Okay, we all disagree on how money should be spent or whether we should be taxed, or I don't like taxes either. All right, but when it gets beyond that, where you're demonizing another American because of their political persuasion, when you are attacking someone and threatening them and castigating their morality and because of just a difference in political, that's when you say, wait a minute, right? Forums like this do a lot so that we can talk and have a safe space for all views, valid and civil views, to be shared. This is what it's about. There is an organization now, I think it's around the country, called Braver Angels. I think they're doing phenomenal work in trying to bring different parties, Republicans, Democrats, progressives, and perhaps maybe on the more extreme right, together to dialogue. I think that is more of what we need to happen. We need to realize that in the big scheme of things, Americans should be sharing common values of civil discourse, decency to each other, human rights, civil rights, and yes, social justice. Nobody should dominate the other. We're all equal. And understand Sometimes, this is my opinion, errors of the past need to be corrected. We need to figure out a way to make right as much as we can what may have gone wrong in the past. If I hurt someone, I should go up to that person and say, I'm sorry. What can I do? And that person should really say, well, if you give me my $10 back, okay. So that's what I'm saying. We have these kinds of open dialogue and discussions, and we need to do more of that. But let me break it down. Don't put it on someone else. Put it on yourself. What are you doing? You know when you hear the stuff that crosses the line. You know, and you have the ability, figure it out, forget a speech. I'm not sure I want to go there. Let's not talk like that. Whatever it takes to calm it and to not encourage people to, because sometimes what we do or our silence encourages people to cross the lines. The silence can be deadly.
I think that is something that takes a lot of courage, especially for those of us who may come across that in a workplace, in a close group setting, in our community, where we may feel that our response to that is going to impact our reputation, how others think of us, but being able to step up and, as you said, not be silent in the face of that is very important. Again, this can be a struggle for us as adults. How do we pass that on to our children? How do we have those conversations? They're so exposed, unlike any other generation, to a variety of sources of information, often not verified online. Do you have advice for us on how we can pass on media literacy, but also those values to our children and how to have those conversations?